Sam Gwynne, welcome to the show.
It's good to be talking to you.
So you're the author of the book, Empire of the Summer Moon, Quanah Parker and the Rise and Fall of the Comanches, the most powerful Indian tribe in American history. I grew up in Oklahoma. I live in Oklahoma. And, you have to do Oklahoma history, but they always talk about just the 5 civilized tribes, which is an interesting history. The Comanches get like a passing, and the story is just phenomenal.
It's kind of it's true in Texas, too. There's a lot of, they just blow by this. They certainly did. My daughter was in high school, 10 years ago here. They just blew right by it. They never stopped.
Well, why is that? Why does the history of the Comanches get overlooked or blown by in history classes?
I don't know. It's a really good question. The plains are the high plains. The Comanche plains are the last part of America to be settled. Of course, the East settles and the West settles, and then you've got this thing sitting out here that is really the plains extending down from the northern plains that were controlled by the Sioux through the central Cheyennes and Arapahoes, and then Comanches, and you had this very uncivilized, shall we say, middle that took a very long time to settle. And on some level, I think that it may be because of that fact, there just wasn't anything out here really. This was a frontier, and because it was a frontier, it wasn't crawling with reporters necessarily, and it just never had the play. And it was even something like the Red River War, which is an extremely significant sort of moment in American history. It was kind of, the end of the frontier. And the frontier ended here in Texas. It didn't end in California. It ended here. These things didn't get covered very well. They didn't get written about that well. And I don't know. It's been a privilege and an honor for me to be able to restore it in some ways, certainly here in Texas, because it wasn't that. The Comanche period here in Texas was not really part of the conversation.
And so what led you down that path? Did you come across a story, or was it your daughter, going through Texas history in high school, and like Comanches sort of got a quick pass? Did you come across something that said, there's a bigger story here that I need to write about and research?
Yeah, so it is all related to me, the Connecticut Yankee, moving to Texas and having absolutely no clue about the history here, and kind of walking around and saying, "Oh wow, look at that! Gee, I never knew that. Really? This is the idiot Easterner who doesn't know any better. That's who I was." And I thought, this is just incredibly cool. And I went on the high plains, and then I heard about these nomadic tribes that lived out there, and this whole kind of world that I had never known about, I've never even heard about, and so living here, so what made me write it was moving to Texas, which I did 26 years ago, and I'm still here. I came here, I was just kind of on the circuit as I was a bureau chief for Time magazine. I'd been in LA, Los Angeles for Time magazine, and Detroit and Washington and New York, and this was another stop on the way, and it was like, okay, but I got here, and I just started hearing. First of all, you start hearing things, because Texas is really close to its frontier. And when I grew up in the East Coast, whatever Native Americans had been around when the white man arrived had been pretty much killed off, at least in large numbers, by disease mostly, but also by weapons and bullets and things like that. And the subjugation of the Indians had happened hundreds of years before my forebears ever got off the boat. In Texas, that wasn't true. The history was right here. It was just in your face. You're from Oklahoma. You know this.
Right.
This is immediate. It's the last of the Indians did not surrender here until 1875, and there was a lot of jostling on and off the res that went on into the 20th century. And I would just hear these stories, and these were, stories that seemed like they were kind of almost current day. It was a very different take on it. But yeah, it was all where I was, and this incredible sense of the land in particular. A love affair that I've had with the land west of in West Texas, and just this incredible history that happened down here.
Yeah, so let's talk about the Comanches, because, like I said, I didn't know much about this tribe. I think when we talk about Native Americans, particularly here in Oklahoma, like I said, you talk about the Cherokees, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, or if you're in the East Coast, you're talking about the Iroquois. The Comanches don't get much they don't get talked about, but like they're a fascinating culture. They were primarily in Texas, West Texas, Southwest Oklahoma, and went into New Mexico, but they weren't originally from there, which I didn't know. Where were they from originally?
So the origin of the tribe is, you sort of put this together as best you can, or rather the people who were there at the time put this together as best as you can. As far as we know, they were originally a Shoshone language group tribe, and they were in the Wind River Mountains, or basically the foothills of the Wind River Mountains in Wyoming. And this would be now going back prior to the 18th century. And from what we know, they were back then, this was before the Spanish horses arrived and were distributed throughout the plains. They didn't have horses. They were a foot-bound band of nomadic hunter-gatherers. And they were, as far as we know, a tribe that was not militarily powerful, and one of the reasons that is surmised is because their hunting grounds were not the rich hunting grounds of the buffalo or bison plains, but they were less good hunting grounds. And so you had this amazing thing that happened in history, and it happened away from the eyes of white men. And again, you ask, like, why do people know these things? Well, this thing you can see in flashes, or rather the Spanish and the French could see it in flashes. But suddenly, what happens is that the Spanish arrive in the New World right after 1492, after Columbus, and the Spanish arrive in the New World, and they bring horses with them. And with them comes this incredible technology of horses that's thousands of years old, that's very specific, and the Spanish are really good at it. And they bring these little horses, Mustangs, that are really well adapted to the arid areas in the West. And they were very concerned initially about letting the technology out, right? They didn't want to let it out because they knew what might happen. Well, it got out. And without going into all of the details, basically the Native Americans on the plains, in the American plains, North American plains, got hold of the horse. And the tribe that was by far the best at this were the Comanches. They were, for some reason, nobody still understands what there was about them that understood it, the horse, in terms of breaking, breeding, whatever it was, stealing, selling, racing, hunting with fighting, whatever. They were better than anybody else at it. And endowed with this new power, this phenomenal technology of the horse and mastery of it, starting in the 17th century, aided by such things as the Great Horse Dispersal, which is when the Spanish were driven out of New Mexico briefly, and 20,000 horses got out. And with Comanche with horses now they start to move south from those Wind River Mountains, which is where I said they were in Wyoming, right? They're going to move south. They're going to challenge everybody and anything in front of them. And what they're going to challenge for is the greatest food source on the plains, which is the buffalo, who are essentially in the southern plains. I mean, there were buffalo in the northern plains, but nowhere near the numbers. So the new power, the new great plains power, is going to do what you think they would do. And then they move south and they migrate, and that is when essentially they enter this. They kind of enter history as they start to migrate south.
And this is, so they became even more adept hunters because they were able to migrate more quickly with the buffalo. It gave them an advantage in hunting buffalo as well, because they could chase them down from their horses. But as you note in the book, something else happened as they started colliding with other tribes in the area, particularly the Apache. Their culture started changing from a hunter culture to a warrior culture. How did that manifest itself? What do we know about that?
Yes, that's a really good point. The Comanche, the incredibly warlike, you'd have to look to something like Sparta, a culture that was built on war, where social status came from war, where everything was kind of oriented that way. It came from a fairly long war against the Apaches that amounted in the end almost to a genocide. The Comanches were sweeping south from Wyoming, what is now Wyoming, into the southern plains, which, as you said, think of eastern Colorado, eastern New Mexico, western Kansas, western Oklahoma, western Texas, the southern plains. This is where the Comanches are moving toward. There's ground occupied by Apaches. And you have this long war that's very bitter and mostly unrecorded and very, very brutal, that the Apaches lose. And eventually, by the time you see, Geronimo running around the borderlands of Mexico, that's kind of where the Apaches eventually ended up, down along a strip along the borderlands. But what's interesting about this, getting back to your original question, is, in the Spanish, before I get to that, the Spanish, by the way, see this in flashes. And the Apaches are the Spanish. The Spanish had this kind of capital up in Santa Fe, what is now New Mexico, and they see this strange thing happening. Their enemies, their great implacable enemies, the Apaches, are going away. Something's going on. They don't quite know what it is. Something's happening to their enemies. And at some point, they realize what's happening to their enemies. They're losing a war to the Comanches. But what's happening to the Comanches, so the Apaches are being driven south. But what's happening to the Comanches is, because of this long war, it reorders their culture. As you say, it's not just it is now a culture of war. It is now a culture, particularly because they're so good at it. They work at it. They get better at it. They can subjugate other tribes, which they do. They can drive tribes off their hunting grounds, which they do. They can nearly commit genocide on the Apaches, which they do. And so you have this kind of amazing cultural shift inside the Comanche nation. And so by the time, the first kind of Anglo-Europeans heading west see them in Texas in 1832 or 1834, it's this unbelievably unified kind of militaristic tribe that controls a 250,000 square mile empire with 20 vassal tribes. And I mean, it's not an empire like Rome, but it's a plains empire, and it's built on their martial ability. So it completely changed them, and it turned them from, I guess, if you look at them originally, kind of a bunch of nomadic Stone Age, hunter-gatherers, into this kind of magnificent mounted war machine.
And so you mentioned Sparta, and Sparta is known for its agoge, like how they raise their boys to become warriors. The Comanches had something similar. Like they had sort of a training that starts very young, like as young as 3, for their boys to become these great cavalrymen, these great warriors of the plains.
They were indeed that is true. And they were very, as the culture evolved, the boys had to do really 2 things, and really only 2 things. And the women had to do everything else. And the 2 things were hunt and fight. And yes, as the culture changed, and as their abilities with the bow and arrow, the abilities with the horse became more sophisticated, these rituals of passage as you were a kid, when you were first turned out to hunt, small game, and then later larger game, but particularly taught to ride. And the thing that the power, the Comanche power came from certainly their ability to fight, with your hands and with the plains lances and with bows and things like that. But it also came, and it primarily came from the horse. And so what was trained as much as anything, or more than anything, was horsemanship. They were just phenomenal horsemen, and to the point where the tales told about them are scarcely believable even today. I mean, what they could do on a horse. It was part of that big cultural change.
Yeah, there are things like, they would hide, like they'd shoot a bow and arrow from underneath the neck of the horse, right, while it's still galloping.
White men couldn't believe that one. Yeah. And the other thing they could do is they could discharge arrows at a rate, that it just defies imagination. I mean, it is literally, I'm snapping my fingers now like that. And if you don't believe me, go to this website where this guy, Lars Anderson, he'll show you. There's no quiver involved. It's a way of holding the arrows. Anyway, all the things that they could do, from particularly shooting, but also just riding, that trick that you're talking about, where you loop down a leather loop over the saddle, over the very minimal Spanish saddle. And they would hang over the neck of the horse, which would, of course, conceal them from their enemies and also enable them to discharge arrows, but with such force that they go through the head of a buffalo. So very, very deadly. And as I say, when the white men first saw them, they couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. And the skills with horses applied to, everything, breaking horses. I mean, they watched them break these horses, and they'd never seen anything. The white men had never seen anything like it before. The Comanches would trail a horse or a couple of horses, and they would just trail the horse. And every time the horse got near, and you couldn't catch the horse, of course, because the horse was wild, but every time the horse got near water, they would kind of bother the horse. It's the same way a wolf brings down a moose. And so this would go on for a couple of days. And eventually the horse was just completely, foaming at the mouth and dying of thirst. And there were various techniques and ways this happened. But at one point, the Comanche warrior would go and literally cup his hands over the muzzle of the horse and blow into its nostrils. And suddenly the horse goes from this wild thing to being immediately gentled. And anyway, there were all these stories that people had told about the Comanches that white men had never seen before anyway. You've got to be careful saying no one. Right. White men had never seen them before.
Well, speaking of something that flummoxed Europeans when they first encountered the Comanches and going on this idea of the warrior culture of the Comanches, they had a specific type of warfare, a style of warfare, when the Europeans first encountered the Spanish, they couldn't stop it. They'd never seen it before, and it threw them for a loop.
For one thing, I mean, the white men always insisted on this kind of Napoleonic confrontation, where you would march out and there you were in your ranks, you would take your regiment and it would be standing in its ranks 2 or 3 deep in the regiment, and then they would line up and ready, aim, fire. Right? This was not. The Comanches would never take that fight. They would never get near anything like that. They would never fight you like that. They would not obey all of the rules of white men's war, which in those days was essentially lining up 2 regiments against each other and firing at each other from a distance of about 100 yards away. And they wouldn't play that way. They were all about stealth. They moved making cold camps, so there was no fire. They swam their horses through frozen rivers that you wouldn't think you could cross. I mean, they attacked by night. They gave no quarter, which is another thing that the white men weren't really used to. But especially, I think that, this idea of completely mobile warfare, Comanches were mobile. They didn't, a dragoon is a thing, what characterized a lot of the troops in Spain is something that a dragoon is a type of soldier who are usually pretty heavily mounted, heavily armed and heavily mounted. He rides the horse to the place of the fight, gets off the horse and fights. It's like driving a car to the battle, except it's a horse. Comanches were entirely mounted and fought mounted and did everything mounted. And it was the thing that distinguished them really from everybody else. It was the complete oneness with the horse. And it was, I think, as much as anything, again, I keep coming back to the horse, but as much as anything, it was the unity of warrior and horse that made the difference.
Yeah, going back to that idea you said about how the Comanches were very similar to the Spartans. One thing, and I as I was reading this book, your book, I was like, that's exactly right. So, training to be a warrior since a little boy, same thing in the Spartans. The Spartans also loved to gamble. The Comanches men also loved to gamble. Right, loved to gamble. The Spartan men didn't do anything except for train for war, hunt. They didn't do anything else than that. Same thing with Comanche.
Same deal.
Yeah. So I thought as I was reading that, I thought that was really interesting.
It's very similar. And in both places, your social status was entirely based on war. Okay, that's where how many horses you had, how many wives, whatever it was, but those things came from performance in war.
Yeah, for the Spartans, it would have been like the trophies you brought home, shields, armor that you brought home from your conquered. Well, another part of Comanche warfare is that I'll tell you how I found your book. So I'm a big Lonesome Dove fan, and I've read the original novel like 4 times. Named my kid Gus after Gus McCrae, and this year I finally decided I'm going to read the other novels in the series because McMurtry wrote Dead Man's Walk, Comanche Moon, which are prequels, and I was reading Comanche Moon and Dead Man's Walk, and they're describing the torture that the Comanches did, and I was like, McMurtry, he's got to be doing some like artistic license. It didn't happen like this, and then I started researching. I found your book, and then I learned, the Comanches were like experts at torture. What was going on there?
Yeah, so one of the things you have to come to terms with if you're a historian writing about Native Americans, and this isn't just confined to the plains, is the practice of mistreating or torturing captives. And it is all over America, North America. I don't know much about the tribes south of the Rio Grande, but I do know about the ones north, and it was part of the culture. And certainly in the Plains Indians it was, and it was pretty simple. So let's just go back for a moment to the time before the white men came. So you would have a Indian tribes that pretty much fought each other all the time. There was a culture of raiding, and the raid always produced a counter raid, and then a counter raid, and then there were vengeance raids, and this kind of went on. And the code was pretty similar, and I don't. The Comanches certainly had it, but so did we'll just look at the Plains Indians for the moment. The rest of the Plains Indians did too. And what that said was, if you captured a baby, you just killed the baby. The baby's useless and an annoyance, and you can't take it on the road, so to speak. Young children might be killed or they might be spared. The Comanches in particular had trouble kind of keeping their numbers up. So they took captives, and they were very welcoming, all kinds of captives from Utes and Apaches and Navajos and people from Mexico and German Americans. I mean, they would take whoever they could get. And usually those people were in the captives, children captives that they allowed to live would be in the 8 or 9, 10, 11, maybe that range. There's a lot of famous ones, and I write about them. Then you have, let's say, a teenage girl or a 17-year-old girl would be made a slave, probably a sex slave, as well as a slave of labor, hard labor forever. And then you had the warriors in the tribe. They would be killed. If they were captured alive, they would be tortured either slowly or quickly, and that all depended on how much time the winning tribe had, or the tribe that had them had. And so you had this idea of just absolutely crazy mistreatment by the standards of that kind of enlightened culture of the Renaissance and, the Judeo-Christian tradition and all this culture that has these ideas of absolute good and evil, which the Indians don't have. So suddenly this culture, in Texas anyway, from this Anglo-European culture arrives on the frontier and looks at babies being killed and pregnant women being eviscerated and, the people being tortured to death by their eyelids cut off, and the penis tortures and the ant tortures and the sun tortures and all the tortures that McMurtry writes about and that I write about. And they're just absolutely horrified. I mean, these white people are horrified, as you are, as I am. But it took the white people to be horrified. See if I can explain that. So there was if you will, a golden rule, like it was a backwards kind of golden rule, but it was still a golden rule. It was you would expect you'd try to treat your enemies the way that you might expect to be treated. And all of the Native Americans out there, if you took Navajos and Comanches, for example, the warriors had exactly the same expectations of what was going to happen. The women with children had exactly the same expectations. In other words, if their baby was taken, the baby would be killed. If their tribe took a baby from another tribe, they would kill the baby. There was a kind of stasis. There was a kind of a stasis of expectation, I guess. It was an interesting moment in history because you have a culture of raid and counter raid, and we're talking about just Indians now before the white man gets there, and all this stuff that just curdles the white man's stomach going on, except that it didn't bother the Indians. Not only that, but you have the culture of raid and counter raid and torture, but also you had this kind of pretty much infinitely renewable and sustainable food source, the buffalo. So there was this kind, if you look at, let's say late 18th century, early 19th century on the plains, this is a totally sustainable society. They understand the ground rules that each other lives by. They got plenty of food and everything's fine. Now, you wouldn't think it was so fine if you got caught and had your eyelids, whatever, I won't go on, but that's what it was. White men arrived, the horror, the shock, and lo and behold, the white people learned from them too. And they, when the Texas Rangers were said to give no quarter, that was true. They didn't give quarter, and not giving quarter, when you think about it, is if someone's attacking a village with men, women, and children in it, it's not a very pretty thing. So it happened to both sides. But it is an interesting thing as a historian. I think as anyone who reads about it too, you have to come to terms with this. This is what they did. And it's a fact. And they did it all over North America. And not only that, but the white people learned pretty quickly about scalping and torture themselves, and often employed it just as liberally as the Native Americans did. It's a very kind of touchy and difficult thing to come to terms with.
It is, because I think in America, I think you note this in the book, in America at least, we have that very Rousseau idea of the noble savage, peaceful, et cetera. But, as you said, it is what it is. That's how it happened. We'll talk about how warfare, how Anglos changed their manner of war here in a bit with the Texas Rangers. But to note, because of the style of warfare the Comanches had, they were able, and also another thing that's interesting about the Comanches, unlike a lot of other tribes, say like back east or the Cherokees or the Choctaws, their political organization, there really wasn't a single chief for the entire Comanche tribe. It was more fluid and more flat.
It was, and white men never understood that. Comanches were organized. A lot of Plains tribes were, but Comanches were organized in bands, and it was entirely. If you looked at it as a management chart, it's completely horizontal management chart, and you would have within the bands, you would have a civil chief and a war chief technically, but even then. So not only was there not one big head guy, and the white men always thought they were making the treaty with the big head guy, and there never was any big head guy. They totally got that wrong. But not only was there not a big head guy, but even within the bands, Comanches had 5 major bands, early 19th century. But even within the bands, it wasn't really hierarchical. It wasn't like, well, the president, and then there's the vice president, the assistant vice president, not like that. So let's just say that you were the young Quanah Parker and you were 18 years old and you wanted to get a raiding party up to go raid the Utes or the Navajos or somebody you were going to raid. Your ability to become a, quote, war chief depended on your ability to recruit. So if you could recruit 50 people to go on a raid, well, you were the war chief. That was your party. And no one was saying, and there was you couldn't be overridden by somebody who said, you can't do that. You could recruit it, you could do it. So there was this, again, if you look at from an American sort of management point of view, it's a completely flat organizational structure, which gave it advantages in some ways, and it gave it also some great disadvantages because of a lack of the kind of militaristic central control that you would have seen in an army of, say, the Civil War or something.
So yeah, all these things combined, their style of warfare, their fluid political organization. So it made it hard for Anglos to figure out who's in charge and make treaties or whatever. That allowed the Comanches to fend off the Spanish Empire, which again conquered the Incans, the Aztecs, these great empires in South America and Mexico. The Comanches were able to hold these guys off for over 100 years, and white people off in general, until the Americans started arriving in Texas around early 1800s, right?
Right. And the term that historians used for what the Comanches were, and again, we're looking at this 250,000 square mile empire that, again, eastern New Mexico, eastern Colorado, western Texas, western Kansas, western Oklahoma, that chunk of land there. It was so powerful that it essentially stopped it did stop the expansion of Spanish power into the New World. The Spanish thought that the place was theirs. They ran into first Apaches and then Comanches, but more particularly Comanches. You had Comanches stopping this kind of northward power surge of the Spanish into North America. You had the Comanches stopping this kind of westward surge of French power coming out of the Louisiana territory. You had them stopping Colt, the manifest destiny, the movement westward, driven by the idea of manifest destiny of the Americans, of the United States of America. And so you had this kind of phenomenal influencer of history, I guess, because nobody could do anything with this. It was one of the reasons, this was the last part of North America to be settled. Is you had an impenetrable block. And roughly speaking, if you look at the war that the Texans and then later the United States of America fought against the Comanches, this was about a 40-year war, essentially along a single line. I mean, it wasn't, the line would roll west toward Wichita Falls sometimes and backward toward Dallas sometimes, but the United States never fought a war against any tribe that did anything like that. It essentially just stopped everything for a very long time. So that it was the reason that in the subtitle of my book, Empire of the Summer Moon, I say these guys are the most powerful tribe in American history. It's for that reason. They held up everything. They stopped everything, and they stopped it for a long time. Eventually, they lost. But But the West wasn't, quote, won, for the white man and his civilization until the Plains Indians lost it.
So this brings us up nicely to where Quanah Parker's story starts, because it starts with a raid on some Texas settlers, I think in like the 1820s, thereabouts, the Parker raid. Tell us about the Parker raid and the ramifications of it.
Okay, so this is the great thing about this story is, on the one hand, you have the story of the Comanche tribe, which is a great dramatic story,
right?
Great arc of the rise and fall of the Comanches. They're this little tribe that a no-count tribe. They get the horse, they become dominant, they sweep south, they change history. That's all big picture stuff. It's great, it's cool. But buried in the middle of that story is the little personal family story about the family, about the Parker family. So what happens is the Parker family has gone ahead and built they've been given these great headrights from the Mexican government. And one of the reasons the Mexicans are giving out all these headrights to people from the United States is because they want to settle these lands, these borderlands in Texas, and by settling them somehow kind of solve their Comanche problem. And so there's this raid on the Parker fort, and this is 1836, raid on the Parker fort, and they take a bunch of hostages, among them, right, Cynthia Ann Parker, and they ride off into the plains with little old 9-year-old Cynthia Ann Parker, blonde hair, cornflower blue eyes, the whole deal. They leave. Nothing, it was the most typical raid you could possibly imagine. The Indians did this to each other all the time. This just happened to be, these were white people, predestinarian Baptists out of, Illinois by way of Virginia. And so this starts this incredible tale. So little Cynthia Ann Parker, she's kidnapped, she's taken away, she becomes part of the tribe, she becomes completely assimilated into the tribe, she marries a war chief, she is, over the years, Indian agents and various people knew where she was, but she wouldn't come in, which shocked everybody, of course, that the white squaw, as they called her, could possibly, want to spend her life with these horrible savages when she could have her wonderful, European culture that she came from. And so this is the first part of the story. Cynthia Ann goes out and she won't come back. She has children. She marries the war chief. And she has one of her sons is named Quanah. Then by complete accident one day, a bunch of Rangers, Texas Rangers and militia happen to attack a camp where she is located, and they recapture her. And this is one of the more amazing moments in the history of the frontier, because you have this, the squaw that would never return, they refused to return to her culture. Well, now they've got her. And they put her up on a box in Fort Worth, and everybody gawks at her and pokes at her and gawks at her up on this box. And when she was captured, she's captured with her daughter named Prairie Flower, but her sons get away, one of whom is Quanah. And so Cynthia Ann gets dragged back increasingly, farther and farther away from the plains, increasingly into this kind of Anglo-Saxon culture of her family, the Parker family, and she's ever more miserable. Meanwhile, her son, who wasn't captured, Quanah, is out loose on the plains, rising to become the last great chief of the Comanches, and the man who finally surrenders what remains of his tribe after all the buffalo are killed in 1875. And so in a way you have this 40-year war that I talked about between the Comanches and the Texans and then the people from the United States. And essentially that begins with the kidnapping essentially of Cynthia Ann Parker, and it ends with the surrender of her son, the last and greatest chief of the Comanches, Quanah, in 1875. It's an amazing they're amazing bookends. Quanah then elects to walk the white man's way, goes onto the reservation, becomes the wealthiest and most influential Native American of the reservation, period, and on and on. And when he finally, and among other things, he attempts to and does locate the grave of his mother. And anyway, the story goes on, but it's one of the great tales of the frontier. And so when you write about it when I write about it in my book, I get to tell that, that big picture tale of the Comanche tribe, but I also get to tell this, but when you're reading that, you're never very far from the smaller story about this little girl and her son.
No, yeah. When you mentioned that part where they found Cynthia Ann again, and I guess they gave her back to her uncle, and her uncle just put her up on that box, and you said everyone was just gawking, and she started crying.
She was curious. She was a curiosity. People really. I mean, it's hard to imagine the animosity that's today anyway. The animosity that people on the frontier felt for, say, Comanches. I mean, everybody knew somebody who'd been killed or tortured, or I mean, it was very bitter and it was very brutal. And so to have one of them, kind of a live one, right there, but she's white. I mean, it just astounded people.
Yeah. And so you mentioned the Texas Rangers found them. And this is another part of this Comanche story and the story of the Parkers and Quanah. Like, this is also the story of how the Texas Rangers, the mythic Texas Rangers, came to power, came to rise. Like, what you mentioned this earlier, one reason why the Texas Rangers were so successful at battling Comanches, that they learned to fight basically like Comanches.
They imitated everything they did. And that's where the Rangers came from. And one of the things I loved about Lonesome Dove, which you and I both like, is that the Gus and Captain Call were Rangers of that era. That's who they were. That's why they were good. They fought Comanches and Mexicans, as everybody did in San Antonio. But yeah, I'll tell you a story. This is my favorite story that came out of my book, and I didn't know it before I wrote it. But so let's go to the 1830s, and we're in San Antonio now. It's just right on the edge of the Comanche frontier. And so back in those days, let's take 1836 and forward. 1836 is now, San Antonio is now part of Texas. And what Texas would do, they were very generous with what they called head rights. So they would give you head rights, with being rights to land. Basically, the land was free. And all you had to do was go out and survey that land, and then it was yours. And so people flocked to San Antonio, and they secured their head rights, which would be, call it a few hundred, 600, 800,000 acres, however many acres outside of town. And then the surveyors would go out and survey it. And the surveyors would be killed in all sorts, talk about torture. And the Indians knew exactly what the surveyors were doing. I mean, it wasn't like, the machine that steals the land. No, the machine actually stole the land, and they knew that. The machine stole the land. The surveying equipment did. So they killed them in all sorts of imaginative ways. And so then the people in San Antonio would send out armed guards with the surveyors, and now the death toll rose. In fact, if you see the percentage of dead in 1837, I think this is in my book somewhere, 10 or 15% of the population of San Antonio died every year trying to do this. Comanches didn't like this. One of these surveyors was named Jack Hayes, and he was a skinny little 23-year-old guy who had this ability to keep surveyors alive long enough to get the head rights and secure the land. And so this group kind of coalesced around him of young guns. They were all 22 years old, and they were all crazy. And they were all very tough. And the Texans had names for them. They called them mounted gunmen, and spies. At one point, they're called spies. I don't know why. Eventually, they came up with a name for them that stuck, and it was Rangers. And what the Rangers did was they imitated everything that the Comanches did. They cold camps. Again, you don't build a fire because they can find you. They learned from their various scouts that they used to find the Comanches how to, track bird flight, how to, cross frozen rivers, how to, particularly horse management, which really the white men didn't really understand at all. They didn't understand how you fought on horseback, how you lived with a horse in an essentially combat situation. And so this goes on, and Hayes makes a name for himself. He's the man. He's got one problem, though. When his mounted men, who are really good on horseback now, confront Comanches, they've got only 3 shots. They've got a Kentucky long rifle, bang, that's one, and they've got 2 single-shot pistols, 2, 3, and that's it. And you can't reload those on a horseback. Can't do it. They were going up against Comanches that had the clusters of arrows in their hands that could shoot very rapidly. They were at a great kind of disadvantage in firepower. And they couldn't do anything about it. They won their battles largely by just being unbelievably aggressive. They would ride forward at full speed, screaming, and they would discharge their weapons, and they would often just win by panache, by just guts, and with very much the Captain Call character in McMurtry. Okay, so now something really interesting happens. So go to the East Coast. The East Coast, there's this guy named Samuel Colt, this little inventor guy, and he's invented this weird little weapon. It's a 5-shot pistol. I think it's a 36 caliber 5-shot pistol. It's got this, but what it's got is 5 shots, but it's also got a cylinder that is removable so that you can shoot the 5 shots, remove the cylinder, and put another cylinder in. And it's just he thinks it's a great, cavalry sidearm and everything. Well, at that moment, the United States did not have a cavalry and nobody wanted this weapon. It was a clever weapon that had no use, that, as far as anybody could see. Colt goes bankrupt, loses the blueprints, it's over. However, somehow the Texas Navy bought a crate of those things, of the 5-shooters, the Patterson Colt 5-shooters, and somehow it sat in a warehouse in Galveston, and somehow Jack Hayes and his Rangers in San Antonio, which is about, I don't know, maybe 200 miles from there, got a hold of it, got a hold of the crate of guns. He immediately understood what it did. Hayes immediately understood that it would equalize the thing. So now the Hayes Rangers, now they're training with these 5-shooters, and they're getting really good at them. And in 1844, they take them out and they try them out in Sisterdale, Texas, at the Battle of Walker's Creek, and they win. And everything that Hayes thought would happen, happened. And so you had this incredible moment in history. Right then, the Mexican War, and the Mexican War happens. People figure out that there are these crazy Rangers in Texas who go everywhere mounted, and they have these repeating pistols. And they now Samuel Colt now redesigned something. Now this is called the Walker Colt. It's this 5.5-pound hand cannon that is a 6-shooter. And it's this, if you've ever held one, it's a thing to hold. Anyway, it's the 6-shooter. It changes everything. It kills more men than the Roman short sword. It saves Colt from bankruptcy. Colt gets the military contract to make the 6-shooters for the Rangers who go into war in Mexico and absolutely light it up. Nobody's ever seen this kind of ability to fight. They're used as sort of anti-guerrilla warriors, and nobody can stand with them. And so it's the invention of the 6-shooter, and it was invented in order to fight Comanches by people who had adapted warfare against Comanches. And anyway, there's lots of stories like that. That's probably my favorite from the book, just because it reaches into capitalism in the East Coast, and Samuel Colt, who, by the way, becomes the richest man in America because of this, and on and on and on. It's a great story, and you were asking earlier about why people don't know about this. Take somebody like Jack Hayes. He should be easily as famous as another guy running around San Antonio in those same years named Davy Crockett. And then I don't know why he isn't, frankly.
Yeah. This is going back to Quanah Parker. He kind of rose to power as a war chief as the Comanches were dwindling in power. And that they were dwindling because, the Rangers figured out how to fight them. But the big reason the buffalo were being exterminated, this is when, again, talking about that cross-section of capitalism intersecting with the frontier, this is when the buffalo hunter came to power, and they were just wiping out the buffalo, and that was their food source. So I think what led Quanah to finally decide, because I think a lot of these Plains tribes, they fought going on the reservation because they knew as soon as that happened, their way of life would be over. They would no longer be the people or the Comanches.
They were going to have to grow beans and corn.
Right, exactly. So they fought it to the end. But why did Quanah, this great war chief who was an adept warrior, why did he decide just to finally surrender and head over to Fort Sill?
Well, to go back to something you said a minute ago, what killed most of the Indians off was proximity to the white man and white man's diseases. The great percentages of the Indian tribes died, including Comanches, from cholera and white man's diseases. And so you had this wave of starting, I guess, in the 1830s and 40s and 50s. It was just, half an entire tribe would be taken out, or 2/3 of an entire tribe. And the problem was that the closer you were to the white man's frontier, the more there was interaction with white men and trade and so forth, and the more the diseases spread. Quanah Parker happened to be part of a band that lived way out in West Texas. If you've ever been to Amarillo, out there in the Panhandle, and his band, the Quahatis, were remote. I guess they were the most remote band from whatever white frontier you were looking at. One of the reasons they were able to avoid disease is that they did not themselves go and interact. They didn't when they wanted to trade with Santa Fe, with the Spanish and the Mexicans in Santa Fe, they would trade through these intermediaries called Comancheros. And so basically they, out on the plains there, they were disease free, and therefore their numbers stayed up. This was Quanah's people. And so what happened it's kind of a cascading effect. The Civil War came, and both North and South governments turned their attentions elsewhere and allowed the frontier to kind of fester. But after the war was over, the people in charge in Washington pretty soon decided that they were going to put a stop to this. And in the 1870s, you have the first of these big expeditions being sent out. We're now going to end this. We're going to end this nonsense. How could this tribe with 5,000 people in it, or whatever, 5,000 warriors, be holding up the entire advance of Western civilization, which is the way it was seen. And so you have this. Not only is it a moment when you have military forces now being unleashed against Quanah and his band and his out in the Panhandle, out in West Texas, but you also have the phenomenon you were talking about, which is the deliberate tolerance by Washington, by the military establishment in particular, of the wholesale killing of all the buffalo in the plains. And for a Plains Indian, the buffalo was everything. The buffalo was the food. The buffalo were the clothing, the lodging, the weapons, the food. It was an entire way of life. Everything came from the buffalo. Without the buffalo, a Plains Indian wasn't really a Plains Indian. And so you have a couple of things going on. You have the military now. Quanah and his guys have Ulysses S. Grant, William Tecumseh Sherman, and Philip Sheridan full attention. And these are some serious warriors who beat the South in the Civil War. And they have their full attention. You have a military campaign being run against them. You have all of their buffalo being slaughtered. And at the end of this kind of last great gasp of all this, the Red River War, it's pretty much all over for the Plains Indians. Now, Quanah himself was never captured. He never lost a battle to the white men. He was out there. He stayed out. He could have stayed out really possibly as long as he wanted to, but at some point he realized that primarily all of the food source was dead. He realized that all the buffalo were dead. He realized that the lifestyle was going to have to change. So in 1875, he and the last of kind of the starving Comanches, who are now eating prairie dogs if they can get them, they come in. There really is no choice. They don't want to go farm beans and corns, and they never did. And when they were given land to do so, they sublet it to white farmers. They never would do it anyway. They were never going to be anything but who they were, which was hunters of bison or buffalo on the plains. So Quanah essentially was the last gasp of that. He was the last one of the last holdouts, the last Comanche holdout. And when he came in, he acknowledged that if they were going to come into a reservation somewhere, they were going to have to change their ways.
And he did. I mean, I think a lot of Native Americans who went to the reservation, sort of this stereotype of them becoming very sullen and sort of not working and just living off the things they get from the government. But Quanah, he became incredibly industrious, he adapted to the white man's way to the point where he, as you said earlier, gained an incredible amount of power, a great amount of wealth, and he also became a celebrity during the late 19th century, early 20th century. He
did this amazing transformation from being one of the most feared warriors of his era. And he did things, he never talked about what he did, but of course, because he was a Comanche, we sort of know what he did. And it was brutal, and he was a young man, but he was a true Comanche plains warrior. And when he had his vision and he went in, he decided he was going to walk the white man's walk. And he did. And one of the interesting things about that was he realized that cattle and land was the name of the game. And he played it just as well as anyone ever did, certainly as well as any white man did. He outfoxed the white man at his little cattle leasing schemes. He was absolutely magnificent, testifying before the Jerome Commission in Washington about Comanche land allotments. He was a true leader of his tribe, and he was the leader of his tribe from the time that he surrendered in 1875 till his death in 1911. But yeah, he became wealthy, built this giant house out on the plains, he tried to get the U.S. government to build it for him, of course, but they wouldn't. He got his cattleman friends to build it for him. This magnificent place called Star House out on the plains. That if you had walked into Star House in say 1890, you just wouldn't have believed what you were looking at. He had 6 wives in the house. He had 20 or 21 children, 19 of whom survived to adulthood. He had children the children married white people. He had an adopted white son living with him. He had like a Russian Mexican cook in there. He would have, Geronimo and army generals like Nelson Crook to dinner in the house. Around the house at any given moment, there you would see lodges, teepees, as many as 80 or 90 of them. Comanche tribe members who had come in to get a loan or a gift or money or to be healed because Quanah founded the Native American church with its peyote ritual, to get buried. I mean, this world of this reservation world revolved around him. And as you said earlier, it would not be accurate to say that most Comanches were willing to follow him and to follow his path. They simply didn't want it to be what the American military establishment and political establishment wanted them to be, which was bean farmers. They never wanted to do that, and they never did that.
And speaking of other people you might see at his Star House, President Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I forgot Teddy Roosevelt.
He made a visit down to Quanah.
He was there once, and it's just great. It's still sitting up there. It's falling down now. It's a true shame that Star House has gone to seed up there in Cache, Oklahoma. But one of the great thrills for me of writing the book was going up there and discovering it. Sitting in the room where that famous picture of Cynthia Ann sat on Quanah's wall, and into the dining room where Geronimo had dinner with him, and so forth.
So Sam, as you said, this story, it's a big story, an epic story of the American West, the closing of the frontier, but it's also had these small stories of families, of individuals. I mean, after someone reads this book, what do you hope they walk away with after finishing it?
I think what I didn't really, when I was writing it, I didn't have an agenda. I wasn't trying to do anything in particular except to present a balanced view of the frontier. But it was interesting because I wrote the book and I started to get these questions that were, do you know who Don Imus is?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm being interviewed by Imus, and I'm in some studio in Dallas, and Imus loved the book, and when it came out, he jumped on, and I'm interviewing him. I'm in some studio in Dallas wearing headphones, and he goes up, he goes, Sam, when you wrote this book, did you have to stop and take a couple deep breaths before you wrote a complete revisionist history of Native Americans? And then I go, like, what are you talking about? I honestly didn't know what he meant. Okay, 1,000 similar questions later, I now know what he was talking about. And what he was talking about was that you had all these kind of myths and counter myths that were flying around in this country anyway, in the 20th century. You had this kind of idea that early on that the army, and you can see this in Hollywood totally, it's the army is all good, it's the cavalry coming in, it's the horrible, mean Indians, right? And that was that idea that Indians are bad. And then you had a complete kind of snapback from that, and the poster book for which was "Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee," which is that the Indians they're noble, gentle people that we just steamrolled over and broke all our treaties and took their lands and destroyed them, all of which is true, by the way. But there was that particular side, and that the "Bury My Heart" side of the myth, or the "Bury My Heart" myth, had kind of neglected this idea that Indians were powerful in their own right, cruel in their own right, powerful, cruel. That the Comanches were nobody's fool, and certainly didn't get rolled over by anybody. They put up a 40-year fight again. They drove the Spanish out of the New World, and they put up a 40-year fight against the Texans and the Americans. But it was that sense, I guess, and I approached it just as I'm a reporter. I mean, I was a magazine writer and a newspaper writer. I just try to, you try to interview both sides, and when you come to conclusions, but you try to be balanced in your coverage. And that's all I was. I was trying to be balanced. So If I talk about Comanches torturing babies, and I also talk about what the Rangers did to Indians, which was just as horrifying. Not because I was trying to make an ideological point with it, but because it was true. But because the borderlands, the frontier, were an extremely violent and brutal place, and the violence came from both sides. And you had a culture of kind of vengeance that comes out of it. And if you've ever seen the movie The Searchers, and the character of John Wayne is just so brilliant. It's this guy who embodies the bitterness of the frontier and what it's like to have to lose people. Both sides had that. And so I guess what I would like readers to feel, if anything, and this is related to what I was just saying, is that I as a reporter, I was balanced. I was sympathetic to both sides because, and were the Comanches noble? Yes, they were. They fantastic. They had a fantastic culture. They're family oriented. I mean, they were also. You can go on about that, and they were also warriors of a very high order who were exceptionally cruel when it came to hostages. And captives. I guess that's what I would want people to know, is that it wasn't. Both myths are incomplete, I guess.
No, yeah, that's what I took away. It's basically reiterated the point that all human beings, are complex, messy creatures, and yeah, as I read this, I was like, I was horrified by both what the Rangers and the Comanches did, but also inspired by both. I was sad, what happened with the Comanches at the end, just seeing that like it was a people that ended basically. That story you told at the end where Quanah goes on one last buffalo hunt.
Oh, isn't that sad?
And there's nothing there, and I think they realized it's over, and like I was just like, that's just devastating. So yeah, it's a really great book. Sam Gwynne, thanks so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you too, Brett. So maybe we'll talk again about the Civil War someday or something.
No, yeah, you got that book Rebel Yell about Stonewall Jackson, and it's on my to-read list, so we're going to make that happen.
All right.
My guest today was Sam Gwynne. He's the author of the book Empire of the Summer Moon. It's available on Amazon.com and bookstores everywhere. You can find out more information about Sam's work at scgwynne.com or check out our show notes at aom.is/Comanches, where you can find links to resources where you can delve deeper into this topic.